I've no criticisms of David Davis, far be it from me. Great admiration for David Davis, and I enjoyed working for him, and I now sometimes enjoy working with him. But David has given you evidence on his relations with the Prime Minister and the negotiations, and having read it carefully, I recognise in his evidence my own experience, and indeed the elements where I shared in his experience. So I certainly would support the accuracy of his testimony to you. You always look back on what you've done and think you could have done more. It's certainly my intention throughout the whole of this process to look back and be confident I did everything I could possibly have done with the foresight that I had at the time. And I feel sure David Davis would feel the same. Certainly in his resignation letter, he set out some of the objections he'd made to policy at the time. But if you won't stand up, if you walk into the negotiating room thinking you're going to only ask what you know they'll give you, which has been our approach, well, of course, you're on the road to capitulation. And that, I'm afraid, is what has happened. But it's not the approach David Davis would have taken. And actually, I think he did well to stay in government as long as he did.
And he received external criticism for not being more active and more engaged, and therefore people being able to go off to Brussels representing the United Kingdom without him. Obviously, we did not particularly discuss that with him. Do you think that's merited, or do you think that...
I think it's not merited, and for a very straightforward reason. In the last few days, as people can read, I think, in the press, there's been conversation about whether the current negotiating team should become more political. And I understand from a conversation, which I'm afraid I can't evidence, Sir William, but I will tell you that I understand that the pushback has been that this negotiation is being conducted by officials. It's officials on their side, so it must be officials on our side. Well, again, who governs? And I think we need to get in our country as a whole, we need to ensure that policy is. We always need advice. We need advice of the brilliant policy specialists that we have. But in the end, if power is going to be used in a way which meets with public consent, which is at the heart of this debacle over leaving the EU, then politicians must have the skills to deliver on the pledges they made and actually go and do it. So we do need to get more politicians into the negotiating team, but that will be resisted by those who wish to keep politicians out of it.
Could I just comment on that, or ask you a question derived from a very important proposal or suggestion you just made? Because, of course, the European Union is not, through the European Commission, an elected body in the first place. Mm-hmm. So what you just said actually illustrates the nature of the problem, which is that we have here in Westminster, and have for centuries had, an evolving democratic system of government. But when you translate the question to the issue of the European Union, you're dealing with institutions which doesn't actually have a political persona. It isn't a government, although they claim to operate that and create. And we know this as well as anybody as the European Scrutiny Committee, because we receive the laws that are passed down through Section 2 of the European Communities Act 1972, which are made in a Council of Ministers behind closed doors by consensus, without a transcript, and the proposals themselves are initiated by a European Commission. Could you comment on what you just mentioned in terms of the contrast?
Yeah. So, Sir William, I've mentioned earlier that I think this is a profound crisis of political economy. I think we are living through a terminal crisis of technocracy, the idea that our lives should be managed by others. I think it's a system I can evidence with economic data, with various literature, that prior to the First World War, the dominant political economy was classical liberalism. State spending was low, the state was limited, money was sound. But we had two wars of transformation, as it was put by a former communist called Burnham, writing a book called The Managerial Revolution, a brilliant book, written in the course of the Second World War, along with a panoply of other relevant literature. But the outworking after the Second World War was that the dominant political economy was what amounts to social democracy. But Burnham and others make the case that the centre ground became managerialism, whether it was fascism or communism or the British managerialism or the New Deal. The new centre ground became government as big as you could get away with, taxation at its limits, sustained chronic deficit spending, and chronically inflationary easy money. And I have all the evidence with me, I'm happy to go on at some length. But that system of government, which has been sustained by debasing the currency for 40 years and taking people's power away from them and handing it to officials, not least through the system of the European Union, I believe that that system today is in profound collapse because the system of money and the financial system cannot sustain this overspending chronically for decades. Now, we've got to look after people, but we've got to get through this crisis. Now, I haven't time to put all that I think about this on the record, but to answer your question about the institutions and how they make decisions, I think this goes all the way back to Plato and the idea of the philosopher king. And the idea of the philosopher king, now as always, is wrong. It's time to hand power back to people and live honestly with an honest and decent politics, which makes pledges it can keep and pays for them in a moral way.
Right, now Grant Davis.
Yeah, well, coming back to Earth, if I may, and the relationship with civil servants, did any civil servant simply say to you, look, if we're not in a customs union, then there will have to, by definition, be a hard border in Northern Ireland, and if we are in a customs union, there'll be no control over immigration. What did you say in response? Or were they too frightened to say the truth?
I don't think you'll find anybody was ever frightened of me.
Frightened of you?
No, I'm absolutely confident that my relations with civil servants were professional and constructive and positive all the time. But I would just say, I hope you won't mind me saying, when you say it's coming back to earth, I would say to anybody who doesn't want to engage with the arguments I just made based on data and ideas, what is your answer? Anyone watching this or on this committee, what is your answer
I just wanted to
the obvious crisis of political economy afflicting not just Europe but much of the world?
No, well, it certainly isn't a WTO and giving dictatorships. But I just want to ask a specific question.
I do not have
somebody says, look, we're in the customs union, we can't control immigration. If we're not in the customs union, there'll be a hard border. It's simple stuff. How do you respond to that? Do you say it's Project Fear again?
We had many conversations about Ireland and the Irish border. And, but of course I don't have a transcript of all those conversations, and insofar as they were recorded I would have to go back to the department to go through my notes. But leaving the European Union undoubtedly raises a wide range of administrative problems, but when it comes to the movement of people, well, we'll preserve the common travel area. When it comes to is there a border today, well, yes, there is. There's an excise border, a tax border, a currency border. So when you look forward and think, what about regulations and customs? Well, you have to just ask yourself the question, can these problems be solved with current technology and administration? And the answer to that question is yes. And I happen to be sitting here with a treaty which solves those problems. So the problem of the Irish border is a very interesting one, and it's a matter of debate which I'm not in a position to answer. The extent to which it's been constructed, which many people have said, in order to justify a high alignment Brexit. Every party to this problem has insisted that there will be no hard border.
It's just words, aren't they?
Well, I'm afraid we're politicians, we use words.
There's two countries without a customs union, there will be a hard border.
No, that's not
things
true.
Will go back and forth, and they'll have different,
I'm sitting here
standards and all the rest of it. It's just something that's asserted, which is clearly false.
Well, I think you need to explain what you mean by a hard border. I'm sitting here now with a treaty which means the border in Ireland will be invisible and compliant, just as it is with excise duties. Remember, if we were in a customs union, if we're outside the customs union, but in a free trade agreement with zero tariffs on all sectors, which is what the EU offered us, then there would be no customs duties to collect. You would have to make customs declarations, but you have to make intrastat declarations today. So, albeit not on consumers going to and fro, but this set of problems undoubtedly are massively overblown. And I am convinced if we can break through the ideological dogma that you have to have political integration in order to have free trade, if we were willing to engage with the solutions which, as I say, are in the treaty that's sitting here on this desk, then we can have an invisible and compliant border on the island of Ireland and be an independent country.
Did any civil servant put to you that under the Good Friday Agreement there's a provision to have a referendum on the reunification of Ireland if, there's a popular view that there should be one. And given that 58% of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain, and there's going to be this problem at the border, however, some people say they can resolve it. I say, I think there's an intrinsic problem. But did anyone in civil service say there's a real risk here, Minister, of basically triggering a referendum, the reunification of Ireland, not to mention downstream the Scottish issue, and therefore the Union is at peril?
Nobody ever said to me the Union was in peril, and I do not believe that the Union is in peril. The Union is not in peril. But the Good Friday Agreement will be upheld. I think I can safely say that I am sure every DexU minister at some point or another has said we will uphold the Good Friday Agreement.
You will,
and we will. But having read it myself...
have a referendum on the reunification of Ireland, which is in the Good Friday. You'll be happy to have that.
No,
with respect, I think we're now moving into the question of Northern Ireland itself as a whole. I'd rather be concentrated on these questions.
I can confirm to the committee that I have read the Good Friday Agreement and I'm well aware of its provisions. But I don't think that the fact that those provisions are in there means that the Brexit makes the unification of Ireland necessarily more likely. I think that's a matter for the people of Ireland under the terms of the agreement. But Lord Trimble launched one of the papers associated with our solution to the Irish border, and no one surely has got more impeccable qualifications on this issue than him. And he stands with us on this set of solutions, and I'm afraid that's good enough for me.
Right. Now